The silence out here was a living thing. It had weight and texture, a presence that pressed in on a man from all sides, broken only by the rasp of the wind or the cry of a hawk circling in a sky the color of faded denim. Caleb worked under that sky, his movements economical and sure, a rhythm beaten into him by years of solitude. The sun was a hammer, the dust a shroud. He was a man carved from the unforgiving land itself, all hard lines and quiet resolve, his face a roadmap of every hardship he had ever shouldered alone. His world was small, contained by the fences he had built with his own hands and the horizon that promised nothing but more of the same. It was a life of his own choosing, a penance and a refuge in equal measure. He had come here to be forgotten, and for 5 years the world had obliged him. He smelled the stagecoach before he saw it, a faint scent of axle grease and tired horseflesh carried on the breeze. It was an unwelcome intrusion, a disruption to the fragile peace he had cultivated. He straightened his back, the muscles across his shoulders protesting, and squinted toward the dirt track that passed for a road. The coach was a lumbering beetle crawling across the vast, sun-bleached landscape, kicking up a plume of ochre dust that hung in the air like a regret. He had been expecting it, but that did not lessen the knot of apprehension tightening in his gut. A month ago, in a moment of profound, whiskey-fueled loneliness, he had answered an advertisement. A partner, the notice had said, a woman of sturdy stock, willing to share the burdens of a homesteader's life. He had sent the letter along with a sum of money, and had spent every day since wondering if he had made the worst mistake of his Spartan existence. The coach groaned to a halt, the driver's call a raw tear in the fabric of the silence. Caleb walked toward it, his boots sinking into the fine powdery dirt. He wiped his calloused hands on his worn trousers, a nervous gesture he immediately despised. He had pictured a woman like the land itself, sturdy, weathered, practical, someone with hands used to work and a gaze that did not flinch from the harsh realities of this life. He had imagined a companion for the long silences, another presence to anchor him against the crushing emptiness. He had not imagined this. The door swung open and she descended, not with the heavy tread of a farm wife, but with a grace that seemed entirely out of place. She was a porcelain doll set down in a scrap yard. Her dress was dark silk, simple and unadorned, but of a quality he recognized from another life. It was dusty from the journey, but it could not hide the fine cut of the fabric. Her hair was a glossy black river, coiled in an intricate knot at the nape of her neck, and her face was a perfect, still oval. She held a small, leather-bound case in one hand, and her posture was one of unshakable dignity, even as her dark eyes took in the raw, unfinished reality of his homestead. She was small, delicate, and entirely wrong. This was Mei Liane. She had traveled halfway across the world based on the clipped, formal letters of a man who had described himself as a simple farmer with a modest plot of land. The matchmaker in her village had called it a great opportunity, a life of prosperity in a new world. The letters had spoken of fertile soil and a comfortable home. Standing there, with the biting dust stinging her eyes and the oppressive heat radiating from the baked earth, she saw a ramshackle cabin that looked as if it were clinging to life by a thread, a half-plowed field of stubborn, rocky soil, and a man who looked more like a weary beast of burden than a prosperous farmer. His gaze was hard, his silence even harder. The chasm between the promise and the reality was a physical shock, a cold dread that settled deep in her bones. But her face remained a placid mask, betraying nothing of the turmoil within. Caleb stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over her. The driver, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth, grunted as he unloaded a single, heavy trunk. "This is it, then," the driver said, not to Caleb, but to the vast emptiness around them. He tipped his hat to Mei Lien, a gesture of pity, and climbed back onto his seat. The crack of his whip was like a gunshot, and the stagecoach lurched away, its departure feeling like a final, severing act. It would not be back for a month. They were alone. The silence rushed back in to fill the void, heavier than before. "You're not what I was expecting," Caleb said. The words were rust, torn from a throat unused to conversation. It was not an apology. It was an accusation. Mei Lien met his gaze directly. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but clear, each word precise with an accent that was both musical and foreign. "And you're not the man described in the letters." She gestured with a small, elegant hand toward the cabin, the parched fields. "This is not the home I was promised." His jaw tightened. The letters. He had let the land agent in the nearest town handle the correspondence, a man with a flair for embellishment. He had instructed him to be honest, to paint a picture of a hard life that required an equal partner. Clearly, the agent had taken liberties, likely to ensure his commission. Caleb felt a surge of raw frustration. He had wanted a helper, a companion in hardship. He had been sent a liability, another fragile thing he would have to protect from this world he had built to protect himself. He saw her soft hands, her silk dress, her dignified bearing, and saw only weakness. "There's no place for you here," he said, the words blunt and cruel. "The coach is gone, but when it returns, you'll be on it." Mei Lien's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. She had faced worse than a sullen farmer and a broken promise. She had survived a famine, a perilous sea voyage, and the crushing loss of her family. She would survive this. Her gaze swept over the homestead again, but this time it was different. It was not the gaze of a disappointed bride, but of a tactician assessing a battlefield. She saw the disrepair, the inefficiency, the chaotic pile of ledgers and receipts visible through the open cabin door. She saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. She saw a man drowning slowly, too proud or too blind to see it. "I will earn my keep until then," she stated simply. It was not a request. It was a declaration of intent. He gave a short, harsh laugh. "Earn your keep? Doing what? This land breaks strong men. It'll swallow you whole before the week is out." He turned his back on her, a clear dismissal, and picked up the handle of a heavy wood splitter. The powerful swing of the axe as it bit into a log was meant to intimidate, to underscore his words. This was a world of brute force, a world she could not possibly comprehend. Mei Lien did not flinch. She walked past him, her steps measured and deliberate, toward the cabin. The trunk remained where the driver had left it, a solitary monument to a future that had died upon arrival. She did not ask for his help. She would manage. She always had. As she reached the crooked porch, she paused and looked back at him. The setting sun cast his solitary figure in a long, distorted shadow, a man who seemed to be fighting not just the land, but himself. For the first time, a flicker of something other than disappointment stirred within her. It was a sliver of understanding, a recognition of a loneliness that mirrored her own. They were two strangers, stranded together by a lie, in a place that wanted neither of them. The wind picked up, whispering through the dry grass, and the bruised purple sky of evening began to close in around them. The days that followed were a war of silence. They moved around each other in the cramped confines of the cabin like wary ghosts, their lives overlapping only out of necessity. Caleb rose before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards her only alarm. He would be gone for hours, wrestling with the stubborn earth, his presence marked only by the rhythmic thud of an axe or the distant jingle of harness. He left her to the domestic sphere, a realm he assumed was her only possible utility. He expected her to cook and to clean, and she did, but not in the way he had anticipated. She brought an unnerving order to his chaos. The cabin, which had been a place of functional squalor, slowly transformed. Dust vanished from surfaces he had forgotten were wood. His meager supplies were organized with breathtaking efficiency. The meals she prepared from his limited larder were simple but flavorful, a stark contrast to the scorched meat and boiled beans that had been his sustenance. He ate what she placed before him without comment. The food, a fragile truce in their unspoken conflict. He watched her, his gaze hooded and suspicious. He saw her moving with a quiet grace that seemed at odds with the grit and grime of the homestead, yet she never complained. She did not shy away from the work. She hauled water from the well, her slender arms straining but never failing. She mended his torn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She was a mystery he had no interest in solving. She was a problem, and her departure in 3 weeks was the only solution he would accept. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west, a great, bruised mass of clouds that swallowed the sky. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and rain lashed against the cabin in sheets. The temperature plummeted. It was a violent, sudden squall, a reminder of the land's capricious temper. The storm forced them into an even closer proximity, the small cabin feeling like a cage. Caleb sat at the rough-hewn table, cleaning his rifle, the scent of gun oil sharp in the air. May Leon sat across from him, a book open in her lap, though he knew the flickering lamplight was too poor for her to be reading. His gaze fell upon a teetering stack of papers in the corner, years of receipts, deeds, and ledgers piled in a chaotic mess. He had always intended to sort them, but the demands of the land were relentless, and the paperwork was a task he perpetually avoided. It was a symbol of his own internal disorder. On a sudden, cruel impulse, he gestured toward the pile with the barrel of his rifle. "You want to earn your keep?" he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm's fury. "Make sense of that." It was an impossible task, a deliberate test designed to make her fail, to prove to them both how useless she was here. He expected her to refuse, or to try and fail, confirming his judgment. May Leanne looked at the pile, then back at him. Her expression was unreadable. Without a word, she closed her book, set it aside, and moved to the corner. She pulled a small stool over, lit a second lamp for better light, and began to work. She did not ask a single question. She simply began to sort. Caleb returned to his rifle, the rhythmic slide and click of the mechanism a familiar comfort. He watched her from the corner of his eye. Her hands, which he had dismissed as soft and ornamental, moved with a startling speed and precision. She sorted the papers into neat piles, her brow furrowed in concentration. The hours passed. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, the only sounds were the whisper of turning paper and the steady ticking of the mantel clock. He fell asleep in his chair, the rifle across his lap. When he woke, the storm had passed. The first pale light of dawn was filtering through the window, and the air was clean and cold. His neck was stiff. A coarse wool blanket had been draped over his shoulders. He looked across the room. May Leanne was asleep, her head resting on her arms at the table, surrounded by meticulously ordered stacks of paper. Beside her lay a single sheet, covered in neat columns of her elegant script. He rose, his joints protesting, and walked over to the table. He looked down at the sheet. It was a summary, a balance sheet of his entire operation for the past 3 years. She had cataloged every expenditure, every meager bit of income from the small crops he sold in town. But it was the final columns that made him freeze. She had cross-referenced his water usage rights, detailed in a tattered deed, with the fees he had been paying to the regional water syndicate. And below that, a sharp, clear analysis. The numbers were stark. According to her calculations, he was being overcharged by nearly 40%. More than that, she had found discrepancies in the land survey documents, small but significant errors that called into question the syndicate's legal claim to the tributary that fed his creek. It was not just an accounting summary. It was a tactical analysis, a legal argument laid out in perfect logical order. He stared at the paper, a cold knot forming in his stomach. This was not the work of a simple mail-order bride. This was the work of a trained, analytical mind. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, not as a fragile doll but as the person who had accomplished this feat. He saw the faint ink stains on her fingers, the weary lines of exhaustion around her eyes. She had done in one night what he had failed to do in 5 years. She had armed him. The grudge and respect he had begun to feel curdled into something far more complex: awe, confusion, and a sliver of fear. Who was this woman? The fragile truce, built on silence and separate duties, had been irrevocably broken. She had proven her worth in a way he could never have imagined, revealing a strength not of the body, but of the mind. And in doing so, she had uncovered a threat that ran far deeper than a simple accounting error. She had, without knowing it, declared war on the most powerful man in the territory. That man was Silas Thorne. He owned the town of Redemption, from the saloon to the land office, but his true power came from water. In this parched country, water was life, and Thorne controlled the headwaters of every major river in the county. He was a man whose ambition was as vast and arid as the land he sought to conquer. He bled the homesteaders dry with exorbitant fees, and when they could no longer pay, he foreclosed, absorbing their land into his ever-expanding empire. He was a patient predator, and he had been watching Caleb's small, stubborn ranch for years, waiting for it to fail. A week after the storm, Thorne made his move. He did not come alone. He rode onto Caleb's property with 3 hired men, their horses trampling the new shoots in the vegetable garden May Leanne had painstakingly planted. Thorne sat atop a magnificent black stallion, a stark contrast to his rough-looking companions. He was dressed in a fine suit, his face clean-shaven, but his eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. Caleb was repairing a fence line when they arrived. He saw them coming and deliberately finished hammering a post before turning to face them. He stood with the hammer in his hand, his posture relaxed but ready. He had known this day was coming. May Leanne's discovery had only accelerated it. He had stopped paying the water fees. "Calloway," Thorne said, his voice smooth and condescending. He did not use Caleb's chosen surname. He used the name on the original deed, a small assertion of power. "You're behind on your payments. I've come to collect." "The fees are illegitimate," Caleb stated flatly. "Your claim to the water is based on a fraudulent survey." Thorne's smile was a thin, unpleasant line. "Is that so? And who, pray tell, gave you that expert legal opinion? Did you find a lawyer hiding under a rock, His eyes flickered toward the cabin where Mei Lien had appeared in the doorway, her expression calm, but her hands clenched at her sides. Thorne's gaze lingered on her, insolent and dismissive. Or perhaps your new housekeeper has a talent for reading maps upside down. One of his men snickered. A low growl rumbled in Caleb's chest. He took a half-step forward, his grip tightening on the hammer. Leave her out of this. The protective instinct was so sudden, so fierce it startled him. In that moment, she was not a burden or a stranger. She was his. She was under his roof, and Thorne's casual contempt was a violation. The air crackled with tension. Thorne saw the shift in Caleb's eyes and his smile widened. He had found a lever. "She's on my land, Calloway. That makes her my business," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a silken threat. "Just like this pathetic little plot of yours. You have 2 days to pay what you owe. After that, I'll take the land, the water, and anything else on it that I find interesting." He gave Mei Lien another long, deliberate look before reining his horse around. 2 days, he repeated, and the 4 men rode away, leaving a trail of dust and quiet menace in their wake. Caleb stood frozen for a long moment, the hammer feeling heavy and useless in his hand. He had built this life to be left alone, to be invisible. But his one desperate act of loneliness, bringing Mei Lien here, had made him a target. Thorne had seen her, and now he saw not just a stubborn homesteader, but a man with something to lose. He turned and walked back to the cabin. Mei Lien was still in the doorway. The placid mask was gone. In her eyes he saw a cold, clear fire. She had understood the threat perfectly. "He will not stop at the water," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know," Caleb replied. He looked at her, standing in the doorway of the home she had made out of his hovel, and the wall he had built around his heart cracked just a little wider. He had brought this danger to her. The thought was a spike of ice in his gut. He had a choice to make. He could send her away, try to get her to the safety of the next town before Thorne returned, or they could stand their ground together. Sending her away was the sensible option. It was the safe option. But, as he looked at the quiet strength in her face, he knew she would not go, and a part of him, a part he had thought long dead, did not want her to. Thorne did not wait 2 days. He struck the next night. Under the cover of a moonless sky, his men rode to the narrowest part of the creek that fed Caleb's land, the lifeblood of his small ranch. They worked quickly, with dynamite and shovels, creating a crude but effective dam of rock and earth. By dawn, the steady trickle of water that filled Caleb's well and irrigated his fields had been reduced to a muddy seep. It was a declaration of war, a slow, deliberate death sentence for the homestead. Caleb discovered the sabotage at sunrise. He stood on the bank of the dry creek bed, the silence of the missing water more damning than any shout. A cold, hard fury settled over him, different from the hot anger of the day before. This was calculated. This was cruel. This was an attempt to break him, to starve him out. He followed the tracks back to the dam, saw the scorch marks from the dynamite, and knew he could not fix it alone. It would take a week to clear the rubble, and by then his crops would be dead and his well dry. He returned to the cabin as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the thirsty ground. Mei Lien was on the porch, a cup of coffee held in her hands. She had been waiting. She saw the grim set of his jaw and needed no explanation. "He dammed the creek," Caleb said, the words tasting like ash. "We have maybe 3 days of water in the well. After that, nothing." She looked not at him, but out at the parched fields, her gaze distant and analytical. He expected to see fear or despair. Instead, he saw the same intense focus she'd had when she was dissecting his ledgers. She was not panicking. She was thinking. "The old survey map," she said suddenly. "The one from the original land grant. It showed another water source. A spring high in the hills to the west. It was marked as unreliable." Caleb frowned. He remembered the map, had dismissed the marking as folklore. "That spring has been dry for 50 years. My father told me stories. It dried up after the big earthquake." "Earthquakes divert water. They do not make it disappear," she countered, her voice firm. "The water is still there. It has simply found a new path, a subterranean path." She turned to face him, her eyes bright with a startling intensity. "Your father's well is deep, but it only taps the surface table. The spring's source is much deeper. We do not need to break his dam. We need to go around it." He stared at her, stunned by the audacity, the sheer tactical brilliance of her thinking. While he had been focused on the immediate problem, the physical barrier, she had been looking at the entire map, seeking a strategic advantage. He felt a surge of something that was almost giddiness, a feeling so foreign he barely recognized it. For the first time since he had arrived on this desolate plot of land, he was not entirely alone in his fight. "It would take dynamite to reach it," he said, thinking aloud, "and I only have a few sticks left." "Then we must be precise," she said simply. They spent the next 2 days in a feverish partnership. He was the brawn and the expert on the land. She was the mind and the strategist. He led them up into the rocky hills, using his knowledge of the terrain to find the area marked on the old map. It was a dry, forgotten canyon, choked with dead scrub. But Mei-Lian, with her sharp, observant eyes, saw what he had missed. She pointed to a line of unusually green foliage growing deep within a fissure in the rock face. It was a sign. Water was near. They worked together, a synchronized unit forged in crisis. He handled the heavy drilling into the rock, his powerful shoulders straining with the effort. She stood by his side, not as a helpless observer, but as a crucial partner. She cleared the debris, handed him tools before he even had to ask, and kept a watch on the trail below for any sign of Thorne's men. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary talk. They communicated through shared glances and small gestures, a language of pure, desperate purpose. As he carefully placed the last of the dynamite, he felt her hand on his arm. He looked at her. Her face was smudged with dirt, her fine silk dress was torn, but he had never seen her look more beautiful. There was a strength in her that humbled him. She had faced down his hostility, Thorne's threats, and the harshness of this land, and she had not bent, let alone broken. "The fuse," she said, her voice low. "It must be long enough for us to reach the lower ridge for cover." She had already calculated the distance and the burn time. He nodded, a lump in his throat. He cut the fuse to her exact specification. He lit the end, the small flame hissing like a serpent in the tense silence. "Go," he said, and they scrambled down the rocky slope, taking cover behind a granite outcrop, just as the world erupted in a deafening roar. Rock and dust flew into the air, and for a terrifying moment, nothing happened. The silence that followed was absolute. Caleb's heart sank. Failure. Then they heard it. At first it was just a faint gurgle, a whisper from deep within the earth. Then it grew, becoming a steady, joyful rush. They peered over the rock. From the blasted fissure, a stream of clear, cold water was pouring out, finding the old dry channel and flowing down the hill, a silver ribbon of life carving a new path toward the homestead. He looked at Mei Lian. A slow smile spread across her face, transforming her usually reserved features into an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. He felt an answering smile on his own lips. They had done it. They had not just found water. They had forged a partnership from rock and dust and desperation. In that shared moment of victory, standing together against the world, the last of his resistance to her crumbled. This woman, this stranger, had become essential. He could no longer imagine this place or his life without her. Silas Thorne was not a man accustomed to being defied. When his scouts reported that Calloway's Creek was flowing again, fuller and faster than before, his frustration curdled into white-hot rage. This dirt-scrabbling homesteader and his foreign bride were not just an inconvenience. They were an insult. They had circumvented his power, mocked his authority. He would not just starve them out now. He would crush them. He would burn their home to the ground and salt the earth, a brutal lesson for anyone else who might dare to challenge his rule. The attack came at dusk. Caleb had been watching the horizon for 2 days, a rifle never far from his hand. He saw the dust cloud first, a smudge of angry red against the setting sun. It was too large for a simple patrol. This was Thorne himself, with every hired gun on his payroll. This was the end. "Get inside," he said to Mei Lian, his voice grim. "Bar the door. Stay away from the windows." She looked at him, her eyes dark and serious. "I have a rifle. My father taught me to shoot." He was about to argue, to insist on protecting her, but he saw the unshakable resolve in her gaze. She was not asking for permission. He nodded curtly, his respect for her deepening even in this moment of extreme peril. He handed her the spare rifle and a box of cartridges. "Don't waste a shot," he said. They barricaded the cabin as Thorne's men fanned out, surrounding the small homestead. The first shot shattered a window, showering the floor with glass. The siege had begun. Caleb took up a position by the front window, Mei Lian by a smaller one overlooking the barn. The cabin was sturdy, built of thick logs, but it was a tiny island in a sea of hostility. The next hour was a blur of noise and violence. Gunshots echoed in the enclosed space, the air filling with the acrid smell of gunpowder and splintered wood. Caleb fired with methodical precision, his movements economical and deadly. He was no stranger to this kind of fight, but he was one man against a dozen. Through the chaos, he was aware of Mei Lian. She did not fire wildly. She fired in calm, measured bursts, her shots placed with a frightening accuracy. She was not just a competent shot, she was a natural. One of Thorne's men, trying to sneak toward the barn with a torch, crumpled to the ground, a cry of pain cut short. Despite their fierce defense, the odds were impossible. Thorne's men were drawing closer, using the fading light and the sparse cover to their advantage. A bullet ripped through the sleeve of Caleb's shirt, stinging his arm like a hot poker. He knew they could not hold out for much longer. Desperation began to creep in, cold and sharp. Just as he thought all was lost, he heard a new sound, the thunder of multiple horses approaching at a gallop from the main road. He risked a glance, and his heart leaped. A posse, led by Sheriff Brody, the weary, aging lawman from Redemption. Brody was a decent man, but he was known to be cowed by Thorne's influence. Caleb had not expected help from that quarter. Sheriff Brody reined in his horse, his men forming a line between the cabin and Thorne's attackers. The shooting sputtered to a halt, replaced by a tense, ringing silence. "Thorne!" Brody's voice boomed across the yard, carrying the weight of unexpected authority. "This is over. Pack up your men and get off this property." Silas Thorne spurred his horse forward, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "Brody, have you lost your mind? This is a private dispute. This is nothing but a squatter on land he can't afford." The sheriff sat tall in his saddle, his old eyes fixed on Thorne. He seemed to have grown in stature. "That's where you're wrong," Brody said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. He turned in his saddle and looked directly at the cabin. The words he spoke next changed everything. "This man isn't some poor farmer, and his name isn't Calloway." A murmur went through the assembled men, both Thorne's and the sheriff's. "This is Mr. Caleb Donovan," the sheriff declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "And he owns this entire valley, from the river to the mountains. He owns the land your town is built on, Thorne. He bought it all, lock, stock, and barrel, 5 years ago under the corporate charter of the Eastern Consolidated Trust." The revelation struck like a physical blow. Thorne's face went slack with shock, his arrogance evaporating into pure, panicked disbelief. The hired guns looked at each other, their loyalty to Thorne dissolving in the face of this new, incomprehensible power. They were not fighting a homesteader. They had laid siege to a king in his castle. Inside the cabin, May Lien lowered her rifle, her gaze fixed on Caleb. His face was a stone mask, but she could see the turmoil in his eyes. Donovan. The name echoed in her memory. She had seen it on the original land grants, the foundational documents of the entire territory, papers she had assumed he'd acquired with the homestead. He was not a poor farmer playing a part. He was a wealthy, powerful man who had chosen to live as a pauper. The lie was not of poverty, but of identity. The entire foundation of their fragile relationship shifted beneath her feet. Thorne, sputtering, finally found his voice. "You're lying. It's a trick." "No trick," Brody said calmly. He held up a telegram. "I was contacted by his lawyers 2 days ago. After you made your threat, they provided me with the proof. Seems Mr. Donovan has some very powerful friends who don't take kindly to his assets being threatened." He looked past Thorne at his wavering men. "You're trespassing on private property, and you've assaulted one of the wealthiest men in this state. I'd advise you to drop your guns. Now." It was over. Thorne's men threw down their weapons, wanting no part of a war against that kind of money and power. Thorne himself sat frozen on his horse, a man utterly defeated, his empire of fear and intimidation crumbling to dust around him. He was ruined, not by a bullet, but by a name. Caleb pushed the barricade away from the door and stepped out onto the porch. He ignored Thorne, ignored the sheriff and his men. He looked only at May Lien, who had followed him out. The truth was between them now, a vast, uncharted territory. He saw the confusion, the hurt, the question in her eyes. He had a shallow graze on his arm from the bullet. Blood was seeping through his torn sleeve. Without a word, she stepped forward, took a clean strip of cloth from her pocket, and began to tend to the wound. Her touch was gentle, her focus absolute. In the midst of the quiet chaos of the surrender, with the townsfolk and gunmen staring, they were in a world of their own. She finished tying the bandage, and her hands lingered on his arm for a moment. She looked up at him, her gaze searching his. He had lied to her, a lie of profound omission. But in the crucible of the past few days, in the fight for their lives, another truth had been forged. He was not the poor farmer she had believed him to be, but he was the man who had stood with her, the man whose protective instinct had flared like a beacon. And he was the man who now looked at her with a raw vulnerability that stripped away all the lies, all the wealth, all the secrets. In his eyes, she saw only the simple, profound truth. He needed her. Weeks passed. The dust settled, both literally and figuratively. Silas Thorne was gone, his assets seized, his power broken by a flurry of legal actions from the East. The story of the reclusive millionaire homesteader became the stuff of legend in redemption, whispered in the saloon and the general store. The townsfolk, who had once viewed Caleb with suspicion and May-Leon with a mixture of pity and contempt, now treated them with a profound, almost fearful respect. The world had been turned on its head. But at the ranch, life settled into a new quiet rhythm. The cabin was repaired, the bullet holes patched, the shattered window replaced. The water from the new spring flowed freely, and the fields began to recover, showing vibrant green shoots. The homestead, which had once been a symbol of hardship and solitude, was becoming a place of peace and nascent prosperity. It was no longer his refuge or her prison. It was their sanctuary. Caleb Donovan, made no move to change their circumstances. No grand mansion was built. No army of servants arrived. He continued to work the land with his own two hands, his days still governed by the sun and the seasons. The revelation of his wealth had changed everything and nothing. He was still the quiet, solitary man she had met, but the hard shell of his isolation had been irrevocably cracked. He spoke more, not much, but enough. Short, declarative sentences about the weather, the crops, the state of affairs, and sometimes he would simply watch her as she worked in her garden, a look of quiet wonder in his eyes. One cool evening, they sat on the porch as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet. The silence between them was no longer a weapon or a wall. It was a comfortable, shared space. May-Lean brought him a cup of tea, the fragrant steam curling into the crisp air. He was studying a piece of paper, the official deed to the property, which the sheriff had delivered that morning, all legal challenges cleared. He looked up as she sat in the chair beside him. He slid the document across the small table that separated them. She looked down at it. Near the bottom, in the space for the property holders, two names were written in the clerk's careful, looping script: Caleb Donovan and May-Lean Donovan. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at him, 1,000 questions in her eyes. Why had he hidden himself away? Why had he chosen this life of hardship when he could have had anything? Why had he added her name to a document that represented a fortune? He seemed to understand the questions she did not ask. He looked out at the land, his land, their land. My family, the money. It was a cage, he said, the words costing him a visible effort. It choked the life out of everything. I came here to find something real, something that couldn't be bought. He paused, then turned his gaze back to her. I didn't find it until you came. It was the most he had ever said at one time. It was more than enough. She reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the deed. His hand was warm and calloused, a map of the hard life he had chosen. Her hand was smaller, softer, but it covered his with a quiet strength that matched his own. She did not need a grand proposal or a flowery declaration of love. This was more real, more profound. It was a partnership, signed and sealed not with ink, but with shared crisis, mutual respect, and a quiet, unshakable trust. "This is a good place to build a life," she said softly. He nodded, his throat tight. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. "Ours," he said. The single word was a vow, a promise of a shared future built not on a lie or a fortune, but on the solid ground beneath their feet. They sat there together on the porch, their hands clasped, watching the last of the light fade and the first stars appear in the vast velvet sky. A home, they were both learning, was not just a plot of land or a cabin built of logs. It was the quiet space between two people, a shelter forged against the wilderness of the world, and the deeper wilderness of being alone. And for the first time in a very long time, neither of them was.